It was a complete loss. The Cathay rat had stolen or destroyed almost every item of value in the caravan in just a few minutes' time. Decimus Scoti's wagon load of wood he had hoped to trade with the Bosmer had been set on fire and then toppled off the bluff. His clothing and contracts were tattered and ground into the mud of dirt mixed with spilt wine. All the pilgrims, merchants, and adventurers in the group moaned and wept as they gathered the remnants of their belongings by the rising sun of the dawn.
I best not tell anyone that I managed to hold on to my notes for my translation of the Noriad Playbar,
whispered the poet Griff Mallon.
They'd probably turn on me.
Scotty politely declined the opportunity of telling Mallon just how little value he himself placed on the man's property. Instead, he counted the coins in his purse. 34 gold pieces. Very little indeed for an entrepreneur beginning a new business. "Hoy!" came a cry from the wood. A small party of Bosmer emerged from the thicket, clad in leather mail and bearing arms. "Friend or foe?"
"Neither,"
growled the convoy head. "You must be the Cyrodiils," laughed the leader of the group, a tall, skeleton-thin youth with a sharp vulpine face. "We heard you were en route. Evidently, so did our enemies."
"I thought the war was over,"
muttered one of the caravan's now ruined merchants. The Bosmer laughed again. "No act of war, just a little border enterprise. You are going on to Felinesti?"
"I'm not."
The convoy head shook his head.
"As far as I'm concerned, my duty is done. No more horses, no more caravan. Just a fat profit loss to me."
The men and women crowded around the man, protesting, threatening, begging, but he refused to step foot in Velenwood. If these were the new times of peace, he said, he'd rather come back for the next war. Scotty tried a different route and approached the Bosmer. He spoke with an authoritative but friendly voice, the kind he used in negotiations with peevish carpenters.
"I don't suppose he'd consider escorting me to Felinesti. I'm a representative for an important imperial agency, the Atreus Building Commission, here to help repair and alleviate some of the problems the war with the Khajiit brought to your province. Patriotism."
20 gold pieces, and you must carry your own gear if you have any left, replied the Bosmer. Scotty reflected that negotiations with peevish carpenters rarely went his way either. 6 eager people had enough gold for them for payment. Among those without funds was the poet, who appealed to Scotty for assistance.
"I'm sorry, Griff. I only have 14 gold left over, not even enough for a decent room when I get to Felinesti. I really would help you if I could," said Scotty, persuading himself that it was true. The band of 6 and their Bosmer escorts began the descent down the rocky path along the bluff. Within an hour's time, they were deep in the jungles of Ellenwood. A never-ending canopy of hues and browns and greens obscured the sky. A millennia's worth of fallen leaves formed a deep, wormy sea of petrification beneath their feet. Several miles were crossed, wading through the slime. For several more, they took the labyrinth path across fallen branches and the low-hanging boughs of giant trees. All the while, hour after hour, the inexhaustible Bosmer host moved so fast that Cyrodiil struggled to keep from being left behind. A red-faced little merchant with short legs took a bad step on a rotten branch and nearly fell. His fellow provincials had to help him up. The Bosmer paused only for a moment, their eyes continually darting to the shadows in the trees above before moving at their usual expeditious pace. "What are they so nervous about?"
wheezed the merchant irritably.
"More Cathay rat?"
"Don't be ridiculous," laughed the Bosmer unconvincingly. "Khajiit this far into Velenwood in times of peace? They'd never dare." When the group passed high enough above the swamp that the smell was somewhat dissipated, Scotty felt a sudden pang of hunger. He was used to 4 meals a day in the Cyrodiil custom. Hours of non-stop exertion without food was not part of his regimen. As a comfortably paid clerk, he pondered, feeling somewhat delirious. How long had they been trotting through the jungle? 12 hours? 20? A week? Time was meaningless. Sunlight was only sporadic through the vegetative ceiling. Phosphorescent molds on the trees and in the muck below provided the only regular illumination.
"Is it at all possible for us to rest and eat?"
he hollered to his host up ahead. "We're near to Felinesti," came the echoing reply. Lots of food there. The path continued upward for several hours, more across the clots of fallen logs, rising up to the first and then the second boughs of the tree line. As they rounded a long corner, the travelers found themselves midway up a waterfall that fell 100 feet or more. No one had the energy to complain as they began pulling up the stacks of rock, agonizing foot by foot. The Bosmer escorts disappeared into the mist, but Scody kept climbing until there was no more rock left. He wiped the sweat and the river water from his eyes. Felinesti spread across the horizon before him. Sprawling across both banks of the river stood the mighty Grat Oak City, with groves and orchards of lesser trees crowding it like suppliants before their king. At a lesser scale, the tree that formed the moving city would have been extraordinary, gnarled and twisted, with a gorgeous crown of gold and green, dripping with vines and shining with sap. At a mile tall and half as wide, it was the most magnificent thing Scody had ever seen. If he had not been a starving man with the soul of a clerk, he would have sung. "There you are," said the leader of the escorts. "Not too far a walk. You should be glad it's wintertide. In summertide, the city's on the far south end of the province." Scody was lost as to how to proceed. The sight of the vertical metropolis, where people moved about like ants, disoriented all his sensibilities.
"You wouldn't know an inn called?"
He paused for a moment, and then pulled Juris's letter from his pocket.
"Something like Mother Pasco's Tavern?"
"Mother Pasco's?" The lead Bosmer laughed, his familiar contemptuous laugh. "You won't want to stay there. Visitors always prefer the Asia Hall in the top house. It's expensive, but it's very nice."
"I'm meeting someone at the Mother Pasco's Tavern."
"If you've made up your mind to go, take a lift to Havel Slump and ask for directions there. Just don't get lost or fall asleep in the Western Cross." This apparently struck the youth's friends as a very witty jest, and so it was with their laughter echoing behind him that Scody crossed the writhing root system to the base of Felinesti. The ground was littered with leaves and refuse, and from moment to moment a glass or a bone would plummet from far above, so he walked with his neck crooked to have warning. An intricate network of platforms anchored to thick vines slipped up and down the slick trunk of the city with perfect grace, manned by operators with arms as thick as an ox's belly. Scody approaches the nearest fellow at one of the platforms who was idly smoking from a glass pipe.
"I was wondering if you might take me to Hovel Slump."
The mer nodded, and within a few minutes' time Scody was 200 feet in the air, at a crook between two mighty branches. Curled webs of moss stretched unevenly across the fork, forming a sharing roof for several dozen small buildings. There were only a few souls in the alley, but around the bend ahead, he could hear the sound of music and people. Scody tipped the Felinesti platform ferryman a gold piece and asked for the location of Mother Pasco's Tavern.
"Straight ahead of you, sir. But you won't find anyone there,"
the ferryman explained, pointing in the direction of the noise. "Maundus, everyone in Hovel Slump has rivalry." Scody walked carefully along the narrow street. Though the ground felt as solid as the marble avenues of the Imperial City, there were slick cracks in the bark that exposed fatal drops into the river. He took a moment to sit down, to rest, and get used to the view from the heights. It was a beautiful day for certain, but it took Scody only a few minutes of contemplation to rise up in alarm. A jolly little raft anchored downstream below him and distinctly moved several inches while he watched it. But it hadn't moved at all. He had. Together, with everything around him, it was no metaphor. The city of Felinesti walked, and considering its size, it moved quickly. Scody rose to his feet and into a cloud of smoke that drifted out from around the bend. It was the most delicious roast he had ever smelled. The clerk forgot his fear and ran. The revelry, as the ferryman had termed it, took place on an enormous platform tied to the tree, wide enough to be a plaza in any other city. A fantastic assortment of the most amazing people Scody had ever seen were jammed shoulder to shoulder together, many eating, many more drinking, and some dancing to a lutist and singer perched on an offshoot above the crowd. They were largely Bosmer, true natives clad in colorful leather and bones, with a close minority of orcs. Whirling through the throng, dancing and bellowing at one another, were a hideous ape people. A few heads bobbing over the tops of the crowd belonged not, as Scody first assumed, to very tall people, but to a family of centaurs.
"Care for some mutton?"
queried a wizened old mare who roasted an enormous beast on some red-hot rocks. Scody quickly paid him a gold piece and devoured the leg he was given, and then another gold piece and another leg. The fellow chuckled when Scody began choking on a piece of gristle and handed him a mug of frothing white drink. He drank it and felt a quiver run through his body as if he were being tickled.
What is that? Jugger, fermented pig's milk. I could let you have another flagon of it and a bit more mutton for another gold.
Scotty agreed, paid, gobbled down the meat, and took the flagon from him as he slipped into the crowd. His co-worker Leodis Joris, the man who had told him to come into Velenwood, was nowhere to be seen. When the flagon was quarter empty, Scotty stopped looking for Joris. When it was half empty, he was dancing with the group, oblivious to the broken planks and gaps in the fencework. At 3/4 empty, he was trading jokes with a group of creatures whose language was completely alien to him. By the time the flagon was completely drained, he was asleep, snoring, while the revelry continued on all around his supine body. The next morning, still asleep, Scotty had the sensation of someone kissing him. He made a face to return the favor, but a pain like fire spread through his chest and forced him to open his eyes. It was an insect the size of a large calf sitting on him, crushing him, its spiky legs holding him down while a central spiral-bladed vortex of a mouth tore through his shirt. He screamed and thrashed, but the beast was too strong. It had found its meal, and it was going to finish it. It's over, thought Scotty wildly. I should have never left home. I could have stayed in the city and perhaps found work with Lord Vennick. I could have begun again as a junior clerk and worked my way back up. Suddenly, the mouth released itself. The creature shivered once, expelled a burst of yellow bile, and died. "Got one!" cried a voice, not too distantly. For a moment, Scotty lay still, his head throbbing and his chest burned. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. Another of the horrible monsters was scurried towards him. He scrambled, trying to push himself free, but before he could come out, there was a sound of a bow cracking and an arrow pierced the second insect. "Great shot!" cried another voice. "Get the first one again! I just saw it move a little." This time, Scotty felt the impact of the bolt hit the carcass. He cried out, but he could hear how muffled his voice was by the beetle's body. Cautiously, he tried sliding a foot out and rolling under, but the movement apparently had the effect of convincing the archers that the creature still lived. A volley of arrows was launched forth. Now the beast was sufficiently perforated, so pools of its blood, and likely the blood of its victims, began to seep out onto Scotty's body. When Scotty was a lad, before he grew too sophisticated for such sports, he often gone to the Imperial Arena for competitions of war. He recalled a great veteran of the fights when asked, telling him a secret: "Whenever I'm in doubt of what to do, and I have a shield, I stay behind it." Scotty followed that advice. After an hour, when he no longer heard arrows being fired, he threw aside the remains of the bug and leapt as quickly as he could to a stand. It was not a moment too soon. A gang of 8 archers had their bows pointing his direction, ready to fire. When they saw him, they laughed. "Didn't anyone tell you not to sleep on the Western Cross? How are we going to exterminate all the Hovers if you drunks keep feeding them?" Scotty shook his head and walked back along the platform, round the bend, to Havel's slump. He was bloodied and torn and tired, and he had far too much fermented pig's milk. All he wanted was a proper place to lie down. He stepped into Mother Pescat's tavern, a dank place, wet with sap, smelling of mildew. "My name's Decimus Scotty," he said. "I was hoping you have someone named Jerris staying here."
Decimus Scotty?
Pondered a fleshy proprietress, Mother Pescat herself.
I've heard that name. Oh, you must be the fellow he left the note for. Let me go see if I can find him.